Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. I was going to do a video on visualization, which is the important chess skill of keeping track of the pieces when you're analyzing, but I realized that I never did a video on the three different types of chess vision and the fact that visualization is only one of the three and what they are. So I thought, let's do the one on the three types of the three types of chess vision first, and then we can concentrate on visualization in a different video. Okay, so what do I mean by chess visions? Well, these are things that you're looking at on a chessboard, but there's lots of things that you could be looking for. And the three types of things that I differentiate, I call them board vision, tactical vision, and visualization. I think tactical vision and visualization are universal. They're defined in regular chess books. Chess board vision, I've seen other people call chess vision. I've seen other places where they don't refer to it as any name at all. But board vision is the ability to look at a chessboard and see what's happening in the current position without any analysis. What do I mean by that? I mean, you look at the board and you count the material. You roughly get a feel for which king looks safer. You figure out how strong all the pieces are. You look for the static features like weak squares and outposts. You look for the pawn structure. You look for, what kind of pawn majorities there are, what weak squares there are, all those kind of things. That I call board vision. So board vision involves no analysis at all. You're not moving the pieces around in your head. You're not really trying to figure out tactics. You're just looking at the static features as they are right now on the board. That's different than tactical vision. Tactical vision is the ability to look at a position and figure out what are the seeds of tactical destructions for both sides and what tactics might be possible and eventually what tactics might actually be okay if you analyze them. Tactics being forced sequences of moves that win material or checkmate. So your tactical vision tells you things like, oh, there's a possible removal of the guard, the back rank is weak, that king could be checkmated possibly. I have a pin over there where maybe I could win material, that piece is hanging, maybe I can double attack. That's tactical vision. All right, so what's visualization? Visualization is when you're doing analysis and you're saying, well, if I go here, where is he going to go? He's going to go over there. You have to imagine what that position will look like. In your head, you have to say, if I do this and he does that, the board will look like this, so that you could analyze it further and maybe at some point evaluate the position that's going to occur. So when you're doing analysis, as opposed to hand waving where you're just kind of moving on general principles, but if you're doing analysis where you're saying, if I go here and he goes there, what's going to happen? Then the ability to see the position when you're doing that, to see the possible future position, I call that, well, I don't call that, everybody calls that visualization. So in summary, the three types of chess vision are board vision, tactical vision, and visualization. All right, so I picked out a random position. I've been using the Paris 19 tournament a little bit for these kind of purposes. I picked out a game between Vachier-Lagrave and Grishik. Grishik was white. And I picked out a position after Black's 14th move. So let's see what we can find. Not in terms of let's see if we can find the best move. Let's just see what our board vision tells us, what our tactical vision tells us, and what our visualization might be able to do here. Okay, so let's start out with board vision. Board vision starts out with things like, what's the material? Well, both sides seem to have 7 pawns. Both sides seem to be missing a knight. And other than that, everything's the same, so the material is equal. Okay, what else does our board vision tell us? Our board vision tells us that the kings have castled on opposite sides. It tells us that white has a semi-open E file and black has a semi-open F file. It tells us that there's a pawn lever between the pawn on F3 and the pawn on E4. It tells us that white has a weak square on G3 that the black knight could hop into if the white knight on E2 doesn't keep its eye on that square. My board vision tells me that bishop on G7 is a very good bishop and it has a nice diagonal toward the white king. My board vision says that the rook on H1 and the bishop on f1 are not very well developed. Meanwhile, the black queen on d8 and the black rook on a8 are not so well developed. What else does my board vision tell me? My board vision tells me that, well, I guess I could look at how many times things are attacked and guarded, but that's getting closer to being tactical vision. All right, so speaking of tactical vision, let's look at the tactical vision here. We've already mentioned that if the knight on e2 moves, that the knight on h4 can go into g3 and make a fork. But we should also notice that white can play g4 right now and fork the bishop and the knight on h5. So there's possible forks for white on g4. Hanging pieces, notice both players are grandmasters, so they're not going to be having too many loose pieces around the board. The bishop on e3 is only guarded once, but it is guarded once and it's not attacked at all. The pawn on b2 is attacked once, it's guarded twice. If black plays a move like queen f6, and then white moves his queen away from d2, there could be a checkmate on b2. For instance, queen f6, queen e1, double question mark, queen takes b2 mate. The rook on f8 has that semi-open file on it, and there's an indirect attack on the pawn on f3. So the pawn on e4 is attacking f3, but as soon as the bishop moves off of f5, there could be a second attack with a discovered attack on that f3 square. So there's possible tactics on f3 as well. My tactical vision tells me the pawn on a2 is attacked but defended. A7 is attacked but defended. Not any other pieces are attacked or defended. So the tactical issues are more like things like the fork on g4 and the possible capture on f3, things like that. Okay, that's my tactical vision. How about now some visualization? Well, in order to do visualization, we have to do analysis. So we're going to have to do some analysis of the position. Now, one of the things weak players do is they don't analyze the position. They simply substitute for analysis some general hand waving. So, for instance, it's White's move here. If they wanted to hand wave, they could just say, well, I'll play g4 and fork his pieces and see what he does. That's like hand waving. Or you could say, well, he's attacking my pawn on f3. He's going to isolate it, so I need to stop him from isolating it. So I'll play a move like f4 so he can't isolate my pawn. Okay, that's again kind of a little bit of hand waving, not really analysis. Analysis is where you're actually moving the pieces in your head and seeing what it would look like. So let's do that a little bit. Let's look at that move g4, which is a candidate move. What would black do? Well, we could pretty much say if black does nothing, let's say he tries to save the bishop or the knight, and then I could take the other piece, I'm just going to be winning a piece. So after g4, an analytical ability tells me that black's not going to do some random move there and let me win a piece. He's going to counterattack something. And what he's going to counterattack is the piece that's guarding that g4 square. He's going to play e4 takes f3, hitting my knight, so that if I take one of his pieces, he can take my knight. And if I play g4 and he plays e takes f3, I can't take back on f3. I don't have any pieces that are guarding f3, so that after g4, e takes f3, if I try to save my knight on e2, he'll then play bishop takes g4 and I'll end up winning two pawns. So I have to visualize that to see that. So if you say to me, Dan, but you're much better than me, you can see that and I can't see that. Let's go through the sequence and see if we can make it easier for you to see what's happening there. So let's look at the sequence we just looked at, where white's playing g4, black's playing e takes f3, white moves the knight, and then black plays bishop takes g4. Let's see if we can visualize what that looks like, and then we'll actually move the pieces and show you. So g4, how do you visualize that? Well, you have to imagine that the pawn on g2 is moved to g4. Whenever you're making a move like that, there's two things you have to keep in mind. One is, where is the piece now that he wasn't before? And the second question is, where is that piece not now that he was before? So when you play g4, there's two squares that are affected. The squares are g2 and g4. We now have to put a pawn on g4 in our imagination and take the pawn off of g2. So for instance, if you play g4 and later on you look at e takes f3 and you say, oh, I can just take back g takes f3, Grandmaster Krogius called that a retained image error. You're retaining the image of the pawn at g2 when earlier in the analysis it had moved to g4. So after g4, when black plays a move like e takes f3, you can't play g takes f3 because the pawn on g2 is no longer there. It's on g4. That would be a visualization error. So g2 to g4. The only piece on the board that is moved is the white g-pawn. So you don't have to imagine the whole rest of the board. The whole rest of the board looks exactly like it does now. It's just that there's no pawn on g2 and there's a pawn on g4. But you have to hold that image in your mind because as you make more moves, you're going to have to remember which piece is moved. All right, so I'm saying that my analytical ability tells me that black has to play e takes f3 if you play g4. So g4, e takes f3. Well, now that involves two pieces. It involves the pawn on e4, which is no longer there. It's now on f3. And it involves the pawn on f3 disappearing off the board. So now if you want to visualize one move ahead, you have to visualize the pawn going from g2 to g4, and then the pawn on e4 disappearing and appearing on that f3 square instead of the white pawn. We're going to have a black pawn on f3. Okay, so the more you practice this, the better you get. If at first you can't see these things, and you say, Dan, I can't analyze with you, I can't visualize, then the answer is you got to practice. Your brain will get better at it. But if you just say, I can't do it, and you don't do it, and you just continue to hand wave the rest of the game, then you're not going to be able to play as well as people who can analyze the position, and you want to practice your visualization. Now, can you do visualization skills to make yourself better? Yes, but for today, we're not doing any visualization skills. We're simply trying to visualize a two-move sequence. So far, we have the first move for both players. We have g4, e takes f3. The pawn is no longer on g2, it's on g4. There's no pawn on e4, it's now on f3. And now I said, suppose we move the knight. Well, where are we going to move it? Okay, well, we can go to g1, g3, f4, d4, or c3. But if we go to g3, he has knight takes g3. How is that easy to visualize? Well, those two pieces were not affected by the earlier moves. So after knight g3, knight takes g3 is just exactly where that knight's been sitting there on h5. All you have to do is realize the knight on e2 has gone to g3. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to play knight to g3. So let's try a different move. Let's try a move like, I don't know, knight to d4. The idea of knight to d4 is at least we're hitting the pawn on f3. The pawn on f3, remember, is now black because after g4, e takes f3, black has the pawn on f3. So let's play knight to d4 to attack that pawn. What will black do? Well, black's bishop and his knight are still forked by that first white move of g4. If black does nothing here and he just plays like rook to b8, white can play g takes either f5 or h5. Because you remember the first move of the sequence that we're visualizing is g4, e takes f3, knight d4, and then if black does nothing, we can take the bishop or the knight. So black's going to save it, but now there's no pawn on f3 guarding that pawn on g4. My visualization tells me that pawn on g4 is en prise now. It's not defended by anything, and it's attacked by the bishop on f5. So black will be able to play bishop takes g4. And that also guards the pawn on f3 because now the bishop on g4 is guarding f3, and so is the rook on f8. If white now tries to play knight e6, forking the rook on f8, and the queen on d8, that bishop on g4 is still on that diagonal. And if worse comes to worse, black can play bishop takes e6. And by now, if you're completely confused, I'll go through the sequence again, try to follow it, and then I'll play it on the board and see if you can do the same things that I did. Remember, you're only concerned with moving the pieces in your head that actually move. The rest of the pieces are going to sit exactly where they are now. You don't have to visualize the whole board. You only have to visualize the parts of it that move to see what's different than what you're looking at right now. So right now we're looking at pawn to g4. No pawn on g2, white pawn on g4, forking the bishop and the knight. All right, black's going to play e takes f3. The pawn on e4 is going to take the white pawn on f3. Then we're hitting the knight on e2. If white takes a bishop or the knight with the pawn on g4, black will take the knight on e2 with f takes e2 and won't win anything. So we said, what happens if the knight moves? So we looked at knight on e2 going to d4. So you visually take that knight off the e2 square, so there's nothing on e2. and you plunk it down on that d4 square where it's guarded by the bishop, the queen, and the rook. And you say, what's black going to do? His bishop and his knight are still forked on f5 and f5 and h5. So black's going to play bishop takes g4. And as we mentioned, if the knight now tries to hop up to e6 to fork that queen on d8 and the rook on f8, then the bishop can take on e6 if worse comes to worse. All right, you ready for me to play it out now? Let's see what it looks like. Let's see if you can visualize it just like I did. The more you practice this, the better you get. g4, e takes f3, removing the guard on the pawn on g4. That's tactical vision. Knight to d4, hitting the pawn that's not guarded on f3. Bishop takes g4. That pawn's no longer guarded. Now the knight can't take the pawn because the bishop and the rook are. And if the knight ever tries to go to e6, if worse comes to worse, the bishop can take off that knight, and black's winning a couple pawns here. Okay, now just because I visualized that doesn't mean those are the best moves. In fact, after g4, e takes f3, maybe it is better to take off his bishop with g takes f5 and let him take on e2 with pawn takes e2, and then maybe take back with the bishop, bishop takes e2, even if he can play knight to g3. Can you visualize that? g4, e takes f3, g takes f5, f takes e2, bishop takes e2, knight g3, and then maybe the rook moves. Let's do that. g4, e takes f3, g takes f5. Now I'm up a piece. He has to get the piece back. E takes f2. I don't want to take with the queen because he'll fork the queen and the rook. So bishop takes e2. And now if he plays knight here, white can play a move like rook g1, but black can play knight takes f5. And black's very happy. He's won a pawn. And he's attacking the bishop on e3. Black has a wonderful position here. Okay, so let's go back again to what we started with. So now we're starting to realize this move g4 is not a very good move. So what do we do if we analyze g4 by visualizing it? We want to say in our analysis, okay, well, just because I can visualize it doesn't mean it's a good move. What are other moves that white can play? Well, white can play f takes e4, and then black will just recapture bishop takes e4. That's possible. What else could white do? White could keep the f file closed by playing f4. Now that makes the g4 square kind of weak. If you play f4, then there's no f3 pawn guarding that g4 square anymore, and it'll be easy for black to stop white from playing a future g4 there. So there is some positional concessions to playing f4. What else can we visualize? Well, okay, we can ignore the attack on f3 and set something up by playing something like rook to g1. So that's a move. Or we could neutralize the long diagonal. We could play that move knight to d4 right away, hitting the bishop and guarding the pawn on f3. What I'm doing now is analysis, and when I look at those moves to see how they look to me, that's when I'm using visualization. But the analysis, which of course is the number one skill in chess, is when I'm looking at to see what moves to play and what he would do about them. If you don't do that, if you don't look at your different candidate moves and then see what your opponent's going to do about them, and you just move on some general principle here, I call that hand waving. Hope chess is something different. Hope chess is when you make a move and you don't look at your opponent's checks, captures, and threats on the next move to see if you can safely meet them. For instance, if you look at knight d4 and you don't consider that he could play knight to g3 hitting the rook and figure out how you're going to save the rook, then that's hope chess. But looking at the moves and analyzing what he's going to do by using your visualization, that's the number one skill in chess. That's why you often see 11-year-olds who are rated 1900 destroying 50-year-old players who are rated 1600 in tournaments, because even though the 50-year-old has read a million books and he knows more about opening and endgames than the 11-year-old, if the 11-year-old can visualize and analyze well, then he's going to be 1900 and he's going to beat the 50-year-old, because when they start analyzing the 1900, the 11-year-old's going to analyze things correctly, and the 1600 50-year-old is going to make mistakes. I see it all the time. You watch the two guys going over the game, and the 11-year-old says to the 50-year-old, well, here you did this and this and this, but that's no good because I can go here and here and here and I can win the pawn or I can win the exchange. And then this 50-year-old says, yeah, I didn't see that. And the answer is, well, yes, he didn't see that because he's not as good as analysis and maybe his visualization is not very good. And sure, the 50-year-old has a lot more knowledge than the 11-year-old, but the 11-year-old has the analytical skills to do it, to figure out what's good, what's bad, what you might do. So let's take a look at that move, knight d4. What could black do about knight d4? Well, he could play knight g3, as we just said. That's not unreasonable. He could also take on f3 first with the idea of when white recaptures, then he could play knight g3. What else could black do on knight d4? Could he just save the bishop? No, because if white plays knight d4 and black plays bishop d7, white can just play f takes e4 and win a pawn. And I don't think black has enough compensation on a move like knight g3. So I assume on knight d4 that black would play something like either e takes f3 or knight g3. If you play knight d4 and he plays bishop takes d4, then black's getting a little weak on the dark squares. White could play something like queen takes d4 with the idea of maybe playing bishop g5 or bishop h6 later. And black's going to have some troubles giving up that fianchettoed bishop for the knight. So knight d4, let's look at knight g3. Knight d4, knight g3. What would white play? Could white sack the exchange with knight takes f5? Knight takes f5, knight takes h1. And then I could play knight takes g7. All right, so knight d4, knight g3, knight takes f5, knight takes h1, knight takes g7. Suppose black just plays king takes g7. Can white trap the knight on h1 by playing a move like bishop f4 so that the knight can't get out to g3? The answer is maybe. That's complicated. So my analytical skills tell me that after knight d4, knight g3, knight takes f5, knight takes h1, knight takes g7, king takes g7, that black is threatening queen takes h4, so maybe white would have to play bishop g5 first. But that knight in the corner and kind of out of the game, white has some good compensation with the bishop pair, and maybe he can even play just f takes e4 and get a pawn for his troubles. So it's pretty complicated, but knight d4, knight g3, knight takes f5, knight takes h1, knight takes g7, king takes g7, followed by maybe, I don't know, bishop to d4 check, or, bishop h6 check wins back the exchange, and the knight's still trapped. So that's possible. We could play knight d4, knight g3, knight takes f5, knight takes h1, knight takes g7, king takes g7, bishop h6 check, but bishop h6 check may not even be the best move, but bishop h6 check, king moves, bishop takes f8, he takes back on f8, and then I try to trap the knight, which I don't think I can do. Now that my black dark squared bishop is gone, I can't trap it. That's one reason why maybe bishop h6 check is not the best move there. So if you can't visualize all that, again, let me go through the sequence one more time, and then you can try to visualize. Knight d4, if black plays knight g3, which I don't think is his best move, then knight takes f5. If black simply takes back on f5, then white has the bishop pair, but he'll lose the bishop pair back right away. If white then plays rook g1 or rook h3, black can, worst comes to worst, can play knight takes f1 and get rid of the light squared bishop. So knight d4, knight g3, knight takes f5, black could just take back on f5. He doesn't have to take the rook, but we're just looking at the line where he does take the rook. Knight d4, knight g3, knight takes f5, knight takes h1, knight takes g7. If king takes g7, bishop h6 check is possible. I'm not sure it's the best move. Let's look at that now. Knight d4. If knight g3, those are the only two pieces that have moved if you visualize that. Knight takes f5, the same pieces keep moving. The rest of the pieces are exactly where they were. If knight takes h1 and says thanks for the rook, then I can take a piece. Knight takes g7, and now if black tries to come out with his knight, I can play knight to e6. So he should just take that knight on g7, and now white can try to trap the knight and get two pieces for the rook. The problem is queen takes h4 is coming up, so he'd have to play a move like bishop to g5 first, or he could play bishop to d4 check first, or he could try this skewer, bishop checks, which I'm not sure is the best move. King to g8, bishop takes, and then probably the queen wants to continue to threaten to take that pawn, so you probably take with the king. Although then I could play queen checks here, but now the knight has a chance to come out on f2. So it's hard to guard all the squares where the knight can come out. I could play queen to e1 and guard all these squares, but by the time I move my bishop out of the way, black's already going to be threatening to guard these squares, and it's going to be a little bit hard to win the knight here, but maybe not impossible. But that's the kind of issues that we have in those lines. All right, and again, what are we doing here? We're analyzing. We're using our analytical skill, which uses primarily deductive logic, chess knowledge, and visualization. Those are 3 parts of analytical skill, but you want to analyze positions. Analyze positions is all about using your visualization, but you're using it smartly. You're not just randomly putting pieces on squares and saying, what does it look like? For instance, in this position, it would be kind of silly to randomly say, what happens if white plays a4? What does the board look like? Well, white's not going to play a4. The move a4 is not a candidate move. It doesn't do anything. So even though we could visualize that move, that doesn't help our analysis, because the analysis has to come with candidate moves that are reasonable. And we've looked at some of the reasonable moves here. We've seen that g4, which is the tactical, move that's enticing, is actually probably not very good. We've looked at knight d4, but white has other moves. He could just take f takes e4. He could, what else could he do? He could play bishop g5 first as kind of his Zwischenzug. Let's say I Stockfish what he likes is the best move here. Stockfish, your analysis is better than mine. Oops, we got to make the board a little bit bigger here so I can hit the start button. Okay, wow, Stockfish thinks g4 might be the best move. But he says it's not very good for white. Now he's down to minus 0.8. Wow. Hard to believe that minus 0.8 is the best that white can do in this game. Oh, now he says it's not. Now he's starting to agree with me that even though g4 is no good, he thinks black's a lot better. And he says maybe white should play f takes e4. He doesn't like my idea of knight d4. He doesn't like anything. He thinks black's really doing well here, that Vachier-Lagrave has a wonderful position, which I kind of thought also. But we weren't really doing evaluation in this video. We were mostly doing analysis. Okay, so let's take a look at what Stockfish wants to do on knight d4. He says knight g3, knight takes f5, and now he says just take back, rook takes f5. And now if the pawn takes to hit the rook will counterattack the pawn on e4. And now the problem is white can't easily save this rook. So let's see what happens if he tries. Let's say he plays rook to h3. Well, the computer says now knight takes f1, rook takes f1, rook takes e4. And even though the material is even, white's got a terrible position, and black's bishop is much better than the white bishop, and the rook on e4 is really good, and the queen's coming into the game. So even though the material's even, Stockfish says black's up by about 1.2 pawns. What if the rook had gone to g1? Then the knight doesn't even take on f1. He takes here and hits the queen. White saves the queen. Black says thanks for the free h-pawn, and black's up 2 pawns. Well, he's up a pawn, but he's up 2 pawns in the evaluation. So all those things. So black has a very good game from the position that I happened to randomly pick out. And it did look like white was struggling a little bit there. I didn't maybe realize he was struggling as much as we thought. But we can see now that he thinks g4, e takes f3. He says white's best move is g takes f5. F takes e2. These are desperado moves here. Bishop takes e2. Knight g3. The idea is to just take back on f5 with a good game. Now it says white should sack the exchange. If he tries to save the rook, knight takes f5 is just good. So whoops, so he should play f takes g6. Knight says, all right, you can get those pawns, but I'll get the exchange. White says, I'll take the knight. Black says, I'll play queen f6. White says, let me guard that pawn with h5. And it says black develops his last rook to the middle, skewers these pieces. And it says black's better by about 1.2 pawns. Okay, so back to the game. in the game. It went exactly this way. Exactly what the computer said with these moves. Queen f6, h5, just what the... See, these grandmasters were playing the Stockfish's #1 moves. Rook there. Every single move that Stockfish says was the best move. That's what the grandmasters play. That's how good they are, and they're only playing a 5-3 blitz game. This is not a slow game where they had a lot of time to think about each one of those moves. So very, very hats off to Grishik and Bashir Lagrave about playing this line. So today we talked about the 3 types of chess vision. There is board vision, looking at a board and seeing what's happening. There's tactical vision, looking at the seeds of tactical destruction for both sides and figuring out what tactics might come into play. And finally, there's visualization, which is keeping track of the pieces while you're analyzing. If you're really good at all 3 of those, you're probably a pretty good player. And if you're not good at visualization, my suggestion is start working on it. Don't say, oh, I can't visualize, so I won't analyze. Say, I'm going to keep practicing doing that. And as you do it, you get a little better and a little better and a little better. It just takes a long time because chess is one of those difficult games where, you know, you have to develop your skills over a long period of time. You're just not going to be terrible today and wonderful at visualization tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. All right, for YouTube channel, this is Dan Heisman. We'll see you next time. Bye.